Good morning. Welcome. I'm Asif Khan from the GIO. I'm the Director for Financial Management High Risk Areas. Some of you joined me on my session on technology and capabilities yesterday, so welcome again. Good seeing you again. Some of you also attended a session yesterday, W103, which was on lessons for administration change on a CFO organization. I think you all will find this session to be also of interest. There's a lot of very good information, probably from a different perspective. As you know, presidential transitions require extensive planning on personnel, policy, and governance. Given the short period of time between election day and the inauguration, a lot of this planning must take place far in advance of the election day. Let me repeat that again. There's a lot of work that needs to happen between the election day and the inauguration. So it's very important for this planning to take far in advance of the election day. To help the new administration with this process and to navigate the current priorities and understanding their impact on federal agencies and programs, the GIO, CIGI, which is the Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency, and and Partnership for Public Service have developed important resources. These resources include specific recommendations for broad management challenges, as well as lessons learned from prior administration transitions. The idea is that there's a smooth handoff between the incumbent administration and that which is incoming. With this, let's go to the first polling question so we can get a sense as to what your interest is in attending this session. You will need to go to the left-hand side of the screen and select a response. I will give you about 30 seconds before showing the results. Oh, very good. It looks like everyone is interested in almost all the topics that we have in there. Okay, well, it's changed somewhat. Looks like about 30% are interested in recommendations, another 20% on the status of current transitions, and then a few on priorities in the executive and the legislative branches of the federal government. Okay, very good. So I'm hoping that the panelists also looked at it just so that they can factor in their responses. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I mentioned, we are focused in on the transition. We are going to specifically speak about the priorities that the executive branch and the legislative branch has in the current administration and the new Congress. What is the update of the transition? There are many positions to be filled. There are many policy issues which are still.
Okay, is I going to hear through my headphones or the phone?
And then finally, we are also going to be discussing recommendations to address management challenges. And again, the format is that this is a moderated panel discussion, and we encourage the audience members to submit questions that I can put to the panel. Let's go to the next slide, please. Very good. We're very fortunate to have a panel who are very well versed in presidential transitions, changes in administration, and changes in Congress. It's also important to know that there's a new incoming Congress as well as a new administration, so it's a very important time. Let me introduce the speakers in speaking order. The first one is Christine Simmons. She's the Vice President, Government Affairs, Partnership for Public Service. The next one is Kate Sigaru. She's the Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And then we have Allison Lerner, Inspector General, the National Science Foundation, and the current chair of the Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency. Let's go to the next slide, please. And the next one. Here it is. Here's our first question that I would like to put to the panel. It's a two-part question. So I fully realize that some of this may not be within your areas of expertise, so please answer what you can. The question is, what are the priorities of the executive and the legislative branches of the federal government? That's the first part. And the second one is, what is the status of transition in agencies as well as Congress? So I'm going to start with Christine first, please.
Thank you. Those are fantastic questions and really hard to cover in 5 minutes. So I'll do my best, but look forward to the conversation as we go through the panel. So Asif, as you mentioned, transition planning starts well before Election Day, and that's because a president runs on an agenda, things they want to accomplish. It's the job of the transition to figure out how the administration can actually execute on the candidate's campaign promises. In addition, they walk into office and they inherit all kinds of things that they need to deal with on day one and in the early weeks of an administration. So the transition really starts in the spring of an election year, trying to figure out what kind of people do we need, what are the priorities of the candidate, how are we going to execute on those starting on day one walking in the door. So priorities for this administration, clearly sticks and arms. It's getting the vaccine out to as many Americans as possible, as quickly as possible. It's the COVID response package that they're trying to move through Congress right now. Add to this issues around domestic terrorism, preparing the president's budget request, a much rumored infrastructure package that's in the works, re-engaging on the international stage, and just myriad other domestic and foreign policy issues. So it's by tradition, a new president has a honeymoon period. Their legislative and success with their nominees tends to be highest in the very early days of their administration. The Biden administration's had a very short honeymoon period. He has the most nominees at this point of any modern president, and yet the fewest number of cabinet members actually confirmed by the Senate. Part of the contributing factor is the state of Congress itself. Congress was slow to organize for a few reasons, including the Georgia runoffs. We didn't know who controlled Congress until early January. That was a factor in scheduling the hearings, the confirmation hearings, all of the pre-work that goes for the nominee into preparing for the nominees. There are some subcommittees that still don't have their budget allocations. There are subcommittees that are waiting for their members. So it has really caused a number of delays. So what does this mean? It means that federal agencies, by and large, are being run by career executives and by Biden appointees who are in positions that don't need Senate confirmation. This was a deliberate strategy on the part of the Biden transition team, recognizing that it would be difficult to get their nominees confirmed. Even before they knew about the Georgia runoff, they had the foresight to say this might not be an easy road, so we need to ensure we have our political appointees there that below the level of those needing Senate confirmation. Many of them are veterans of public service, but they've also been out of the loop for 4 years. So they're really trying to catch up and understand the management and the policy and the operational challenges within the agencies. Members of Congress and their staffs are still getting organized, figuring out how they can work together. The insurrection on January 6th did real harm to relationships on Capitol Hill. There is very little trust, and that's going to make legislating difficult. So I suspect that members will be working actively to identify the issues they can work on that are nonpartisan, issues of management, talent, financial management, technology, efficiency, innovation. These are the kind of issues that lend themselves to with more bipartisan cooperation. We've had multiple conversations with different congressional offices, and members on both sides of the aisle are saying, we would love some ideas of things we can work on that are not going to be partisan, difficult issues, but rather places where there can be some unity or some alignment. Despite all the rhetoric that everybody reads and sees and hears, there are real desires among many members in both the House and the Senate to solve meaningful problems. And I think that the oversight environment is going to be a place where they can really dig into some issues. and taking advantage of the resources out there and the opportunities to learn from GAO, from the IG community, from others who are in civil society, and kind of shining a spotlight and putting data out there is going to be really attractive and helpful. So I'll pause there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Great. Well, thank you, Christine. That was very good. Kate, you're up next. The same question for you.
Thank you, Asif. As you can tell, I'm having a few technical difficulties this morning, so if you're having difficulty hearing me, please let me know.
We can hear you fine. Go ahead, Kate.
Great, thank you. So since GAO is in the legislative branch, I'll focus my comments in this session largely around the Congress, and Christine did a great job of setting that up, so thank you, Christine. I'll start by saying a few words about GAO's role. The Presidential Transition Act does state that GAO staff can provide assistance to the incoming administration. And in recent years, we've done that by making materials available on our website, both for the new Congress and the new administration. And of course, we offer briefings and make our experts available to the transition team and the new members of Congress. And the website link for our transition material is on our website, and it's been up for a while. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the key elements we think that the administration should focus on in the next session. So GAO did reach out to the transition teams, and these are the so-called landing teams that are designated by an incoming administration to contact each agency between the election and the inauguration, and they want to focus on key information that they need for a successful transition. In part because the transition was somewhat delayed, and there were a few elements of the transition that were rather rocky. GAO did hear a fair amount from the incoming Biden landing teams, in particular focusing on how they could make sure that the Biden pandemic plan would get implemented quickly. And we had done a number of cross-cutting reports on the COVID-19 federal response, and were able to be helpful in that regard. I would note that the Presidential Transition Act has been reformed and revised after each recent transition as we learn more about this, so maybe we'll see the Congress take that on again in this session. So in terms of the new Congress, I want to note that the old one was very busy up until the very last days of calendar year 2020. They needed to pass the appropriations bill, they needed to pass a new COVID-19 bill, and to respond to the president's veto of the Defense Act. However, they were starting to get organized for the new Congress. In the House, it was much more straightforward, as Christine noted, because it was clear who the majority was going to be, and the committees and the leadership could start to get organized in 2020. In the Senate, the majority wasn't determined until January 7th, and then the agreement on how the two parties were actually going to share power didn't get struck until several weeks after that, because we haven't had a 50-50 split like this in the Senate since the year 2000. And of course, the Senate was dealing with impeachment and its responsibilities to consider and confirm the new president's nominees. So the Senate did get off to a later start than the House was able to. So what the Senate does need to do, and the House, first of all, is the new COVID bill, and their goal is to try to pass that and have it enacted by March 14th. So that is taking up a lot of the legislative room right now. Another challenge for the Congress will be that they will receive the president's proposed budget late, as is typical when a new president comes into office. So there may be a slow start to the appropriations process for fiscal year 2022. And the Congress will also need to raise the debt ceiling this year, which is often a difficult process to undertake. I do expect an attempt at an infrastructure bill. In particular, the highway program does need to be reauthorized. And for those of you following accountability issues, you will note that HR 23, the Inspector General Protection Act, has already passed the House, and experts seem to think there's some chance for that to pass in the Senate. As Christine mentioned, the House and the Senate are focused on the events of January 6th and trying to decide on a path forward for investigating them, including a possible commission. And these are only a few of the many plans and ambitions mentioned by Congress. Others include immigration, postal service, emerging national security issues, and many others. In terms of what GAO will be doing, we'll be supporting the Congress early on by issuing some of our periodic products. We hope that they will be useful as the Congress decides on its oversight and legislative agendas. These include our high risk list update, which will be out next week. We issue that for each new Congress. We will also be updating on the federal fiscal condition at the end of March, at the same time as the consolidated financial statements are issued. We will issue in April our 6th cross-cutting report on duplication and overlap within the federal government. And we will issue our annual high priority recommendation letters to each major federal agency in May. And we hope that all of that is useful to the Congress. With that, Asif, I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Great, thank you, Kate. Thank you. Allison, you're next.
Thanks so much, Asif. And I'm happy to talk about, the Inspector General community's role in presidential transitions. We occupy a unique position in American government in that we are nonpartisan, independent oversight professionals located within, practically every federal agency. And even though half of the inspector generals approximately are appointed by the president, historically, those positions, those IGs don't change with the administration. Going back to 1981, the tradition has been that presidentially appointed IGs hold over from transition to transition. So because we have these open-ended tenures, we have as real insights into what is working well within our agencies and where challenges exist. So SIGI has long, even before SIGI, the IG community has long been a key player in presidential transitions because of the insights that we can provide to incoming administrations about the agencies that they're taking over control of. So starting in 2017 and again this year in 2021, SIGI's created a presidential transition handbook. And that handbook, of course, recommends that transition teams engage early and often with IGs and meet separately with them as part of their efforts within the new organizations. And that has seemed to work well. I know, I've had early meetings with the landing team, or the agency review team, I think was the term that I was hearing this time around at NSF, and I know my peers across the community have done that as well. And that's in addition to meeting with the other career officials in the agency, you can get a unique and unvarnished perspective from inspectors general. And so we're grateful at the administrations that we've dealt with, willingness to engage with us. We also, in the context of transitions, meet with the SIGI meets with the leadership of the new administration to ensure that they understand the role of inspectors general and the value that we can add to them. And one of the things we always prioritize is the issue of vacant IG positions. That it's not uncommon for an administration to begin with many vacant presidential appointments for inspector general slots. The previous administration, at the start of the Trump administration, there were 8 vacant IG positions. Currently, there are 13 vacant presidentially appointed IGs, and that's a significant percentage of our 75 total. So we want to get that on the radar of the Presidential Personnel Office as quickly as possible, especially since 4 of those vacancies that currently existed at the start of the previous administration. So, and that includes the Department of Defense, and the CIA vacancies. So they are significant and longstanding vacancies that do need to be filled. The IG community also engages with Congress. The IG Act sets us out with reporting responsibilities both to our agency heads and to Congress. So we engage with the new Congress, and we usually start by sharing a letter with them that sets forth the priorities of our community, which we did in January of this year. And that document's available on the IGNet website. But it this year highlights, it focuses on many areas, including changes that we see as necessary to ensure the continued independence of inspectors general, which is a matter of obviously great importance to us as a community. So I think that covers what I have to say about our community's role in transitions. Back to you, Asif.
Great, very good. Thank you, Alison. I've got a few questions coming in the chat box. Let me start with you, Alison, first, and I've got one for Christine and one for Kate. I mean, there are several questions, but I'm going to summarize that. There was little concern under the prior administration about the tenure of IGs. Some were, let go unexpectedly. People are wondering if there's time for putting legislation in place to be able to prevent that, so the IGs are more independent. So I don't know if you have any views on that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of our key priorities is advocating for changes to the Vacancies Reform Act that would ensure that individuals who are put in the position to act as an inspector general are independent in mind and appearance. Under the previous administration, we had when there were vacant IG positions, we had some instances where political appointees were put in to serve as acting IGs. And while that's legal under the Vacancies Reform Act, from our perspective, having someone who was a political appointee serving in the nonpartisan independent role of an inspector general didn't meet that standard of independent in mind and appearance. And we are recommending a change to the Vacancies Reform Act that would require that vacant IG positions be filled with either the first assistant, usually the deputy IG, or by a presidentially appointed IG or a senior person from within the IG community, which would enable us to ensure that we had someone in that acting role that understood and could be perceived as acting independently. So we have other changes that we're proposing as well to be responsive to the concerns that people had that arose, especially when 2 IGs were removed this summer.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Kate, question for you. It's we speak about transition, change in administration, and at the same point, there's a change in Congress as well. Is it? I mean, are both these the same, or is it there's a slightly different path to the changes with the new members coming on board, which happens every 2 years, whereas a change in administration is every 4 years? Are there any differences in looking at these changes in administration, or they are pretty much the same?
I think they're pretty different, Asif. Thanks for that question. With regard to the new administration coming in, the number of positions to fill, particularly if the new administration coming in is of a different party, is a really massive change that needs to occur. So it's both positions to fill, it's considering what policies to consider from the previous administration or not, and if not, what the approach will be to trying to change those positions in particular. And for the new members of Congress coming in, there is a set of educational classes and orientation classes set up but the need for that Congress to do something very new and different is something that's more routine, right? At the end of every Congress, all legislation goes away and needs to be reintroduced, and there are methods for making that happen, and it is meant to be a more transitional organization than the president. I might mention a couple of ways in which the two interact. So there is this concept of midnight rules and midnight regulations that an outgoing administration might put into place in the last few months of the administration in the hopes of assuring that its policies continue. And the Congress can have a role in considering whether to change those under the Congressional Review Act. It doesn't appear that this Congress is going to make a lot of use of that particular tool. And then the other thing that GAO typically gets involved in is what's called burrowing in. And this is for appointed members of the previous administration to take on civil service positions before the end of a presidential transition. There are certain rules that OPM has about how that is supposed to take place. And the Congress often looks to GAO to help them monitor that particular issue. Thanks, Asif.
Great. Thank you, Kate. I have a few questions for you, Christine. Let me maybe start with the transition. I mean, like, it's a very short, condensed time period. Is there an ideal time period that you all have identified when the transition should really begin? Because looking back a year, even before the elections, I mean, candidates are campaigning, they're in Iowa caucus, everything is very busy. Who would have time to think about transition? I mean, they have to go get nominated to all the elections. Any thoughts on that? And let me, because that's linked with trust question. I mean, there's question coming in, how do you build back trust in government? So I don't know if that's one question or they're two different questions.
I'll take both of those. And thank you so much for those questions, because the issue of trust and building a relationship with the career workforce is something that the Partnership for Public Service is constantly trying to drill into the transition teams and the people that we work with in transition. So starting in spring of an election year, even when the primary season is in full swing, many of the candidates are already planning for their transition, because you're right, they don't have time to worry about a transition. They're trying to win a primary, right? And win elections in order to become the candidate. But they need somebody to be thinking about this. And so in the case of now President Biden, then candidate Biden turned to his former chief of staff, one of his closest friends, Ted Kaufman, to worry about the transition. So Ted wasn't on the campaign trail. That was for the campaign to work on and the candidate. And Biden had the confidence that Ted and the team that Ted built of senior Biden aides and other people who just had deep knowledge in the space, they could do the work on transition and preparing. And that typically involves, as Kate and others have mentioned, setting up the agency review teams. Like, what do we need to know about these agencies in order to take over should the candidate win? Who are the people that we need to have in those political appointments? How are we going to get our policy done? And how do we work with the career people who are already in government to make all of this happen and to make the administration successful? So some of the resources that we've built on our Center for Presidential Transition are devoted to helping answer those questions, including what does that career political interface look like? How do people get off to a good start with their career leaders, and why it makes sense to do so, why the career workforce is really the key for an administration in being successful in implementing their agenda. And we were pleased to see President Biden make some effort as he's swearing in his new cabinet secretaries to address the career workforce and address the people who are public servants and let him know, you're on our team. It's not a case of politicals versus careers. It's a case of, like, we all need to work together to solve the problems facing this country in a very significant way. So is it going to be imperfect? Yes, there are going to be people coming in who've never served in government before and might not understand that interface and what the career workforce is really about. but that's part of our job, is to try to help their learning curve and make sure that they understand the incredible asset that they have, and it's to their benefit as new political leaders to develop that relationship.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. There are a lot of other good questions coming in, but I'll move on to our next polling question. Monica, do you want to go to our next polling question? Now, this is interesting. This is open-ended. In a few words, what are some of the most important changes the federal government should make? So the idea is, once you enter the information, it's going to show as a word cloud. And I'm curious as to how that works. I mean, it's pretty effective to highlight some of the key words, the key thoughts people have. I'm just waiting to see how that may work out in this instance. Okay, the first one is IT modernization. Improve hiring process. I think the next one is technology, response time, accountability, confirm appointees, implement greater telework, cycles of audit, accountable, climate change, stop the double standards, professional acumen, address the deficit, infrastructure, balanced budget, hiring, more use of technology, healthcare budget, cybersecurity, consistent levels of service, transparency, trust, strength, and democracy, hiring younger generation, IT modernization, agility for policy, and okay, it's duplication and overlap, bipartisan cooperation, less polarization. Okay, so I think I appreciate you guys sharing what's on the top of your mind. Hopefully the panelists can also see what the response is. And I think, Monica, we'll move on to our next slide. Thank you. Thank you, folks, for participating in that poll. It was useful to get your input and see what's important to you all. Next slide, please, Monica. This will be our second question. Let me ask that question. What are the broad management challenges facing government agencies and programs? What are some of the recommendations to address these challenges? And let me start with you, Christine.
Thank you so much. Gosh, that was fascinating to see. I would love to talk about each and every one of those issues, but we just don't have time to do that. I will say the one thing I don't think there's going to be legislative progress on in the next 2 years are term limits for members of Congress. So I saw that one and I thought, well, that's probably not one we're going to see action on, but many of the other issues that were on that list are things that I'm optimistic about. One, I want to dissociate myself with Allison's comments on the need to reform the Vacancies Act. We actually issued a report on this very topic late last year called The Replacements, that talks about the reasons that the Vacancies Act is just not adequate to deal with these situations. And we included a specific mention of the exact situation around inspectors general that Allison alluded to, and the need to protect the really unique role of inspectors general, including when there's an acting person in that role. So there's this real tension that I am seeing in a number of places where Congress is reacting to actions that the last administration took that were unusual, and how is it possible to both address those issues but not overcorrect so that it then creates new problems. So we're seeing this in a few different places. So let me just talk about a couple of bright spots. Hiring was something that people talked about on the list. The National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service issued a report last year, Inspired to Serve, that includes recommendations around the civil service, and in particular hiring, a lot around bringing in new talent and how to do so in a more streamlined way. I expect that to really give some wind in the sails of efforts to modernize hiring. And that's something that we are very actively working on at the Partnership for Public Service. We talk about this a little bit more in our roadmap for reform, which you can find on our website. But that's a place where I'm very hopeful that there will be good progress this year on a bipartisan basis. Second area I will talk about is something that I think was captured clearly in some of the comments around just technology. Government today is fundamentally different than it was a year ago before the pandemic. And we have seen in some really striking ways that the technology and the use of technology for places where we didn't have updated technology has really made a huge impact. For example, telemedicine is now up 1,700% with the Native American population served by the Indian Health Service. The Veterans Benefits Administration has demonstrated greater productivity in a remote working environment than before COVID. So these are innovations that were necessitated by a terrible global pandemic, but are they a new best practice? And where can we harness those innovations to become the new standard by which government operates? And that's going to be, I think, an exciting challenge that makes the case for IT modernization. And we've seen in places where agencies had been investing and Congress had supported their long-term investment, they were better positioned to pivot to the remote working environment. We issued earlier this week, a list of case studies and examples where government innovated. We're calling it Bright Spots, and that's available on our website, but it talks about all these different really interesting ways where partnerships and investments have paid off in ways that should be captured and be the new standard. Last thing I'll share on this question is the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is clearly a very strong emphasis for the Biden administration and for Congress. Some of you may not be aware that Congress established a new Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that has a person appointed by the Democrats and a person appointed by the Republicans as co-leaders of that office. So it's something that is being recognized in both branches as a place where government needs to do more, can do much better. It manifests itself in so many different areas. Just one interesting example that I learned about recently is the challenge in the security clearance process. For people who do not have an Anglo-sounding name, it can be more difficult for them to get hired and get through a security clearance process because sometimes hiring managers will say, oh, if they have family overseas, it's going to be too hard to get them through the process. We'll move on and go to a candidate we think is going to be easier to hire, easier to get a clearance for. That is a terrible waste of incredibly talented people who we can bring into government. So all kinds of opportunities to address this issue in how we operate and work, and it's clearly a priority for our new leaders in both branches of government. I will leave it there.
Great, thank you, Christine. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Asif. So I'll mention what GAO has officially said on this matter. So I mentioned that we have a transition website, and it sort of takes two approaches to answering these questions, Asif. One is to say, what are the major issues facing America? And in those, we focus on three. The most obvious is the coronavirus pandemic, race in America, following up on what Christine just said, and the federal response to economic downturns. And so if you go to the website, you'll see a link to a variety of different recent products, sort of a curated list on those topics. And with regard to the COVID epidemic in particular, what you'll find is these cross-cutting reports we've done on virtually every aspect of the federal response, including most recently on January 27th. And it will also features newest work by our newest team, our Science and Technology Assessment team, including a lot of short explainers on COVID topics. But I'll turn to, in the interest of time, in addition to the race in America and the downturn issue, we also focus a lot of our space and our thinking around what federal agencies need to do in terms of the basic building blocks in order to carry out any reforms that incoming leaders want to make in these and other areas. So we mentioned the importance of improving the government's ability to respond to certain strategic challenges. These echo a few of what Christine said. First of all, making sure that the federal government has the human capital necessary to manage federal programs and implement any reforms that are enacted. The numbers of people, the skills, and the nimbleness in hiring that is appropriate, and this has been on GAO's high-risk list for years. IT was mentioned in the word cloud. There's a lot of challenges in acquiring it and managing it efficiently that the federal government still needs to improve on. And of course, having in place the cybersecurity procedures to prevent breaches and other problems that occur related to breaches. And of course, when they do occur, responding quickly and effectively and in a cross-federal government manner, including support to the private sector where necessary. Fiscal pressures is another huge challenge. We've raised concern for years about deficits and debt and the ability of the federal government to finance the basic entitlements like Medicare and Social Security, in addition to the many other demands of responding to the pandemic and other important priorities. We also talk about key management areas. Some are on our high risk list, things like managing the business of the Department of Defense, huge issue. Responding to the opioid crisis, which has only gotten worse over the past year. The federal fiscal risks associated with climate change and responding to the effects of climate change, the many infrastructure pressures we face, and then of course, key to making all of these reforms happen is collaboration across federal agencies and with state and local governments who are on the ground working with people every day. So when we unveil our new and updated high-risk list next Tuesday with testimony from the Comptroller General, you'll be hearing about those issues and others. Thank you, Asif.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. Over to you, Allison. Same question.
Great. Thanks. Well, SIGI has two wonderful reports. It rolled them out, both SIGI and the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which is a committee within SIGI that Congress created this year and funded and directed to engage in deep oversight of the CARES Act and related and other pandemic related funding and the impacts of the pandemic on the federal government. So we have two reports on top management and performance challenges, one by SIGI and one by the PRAC. The SIGI report is the second of its kind. We did the first one at the start of the last Congress, and it builds on the reports that most IGs do on top management challenges within their agencies. What we did was examine all of those reports that had been issued to try to identify cross-cutting challenges. And the report this year, as no real surprise, there are 7 challenges in it. The top challenge that was identified by 73% of the respondents was information technology, security, and management. That's an evergreen challenge. I think it was certainly a challenge we listed the last time around, but it's even more important with everyone working remotely. That's put greater stress and strain on IT systems and operations. So it's not surprising that that's at the top of that list. The report also had a new challenge that was not in our first report in 2018, and that was a challenge focused on Homeland Security, disaster preparedness, and COVID-19. What we also recognized is that some of the other challenges that we note here, IT management, human capital management, grant and procurement management, they are long-standing challenges that the government has faced, but they are also affected by the pandemic and the move to a remote environment. So some of the challenges are the same, but the nature of them has changed significantly in the 2 years since our last report. The pandemics report, the PRAC's report, as you might imagine, is more focused like a laser beam on the impacts of the pandemic. And this is their second report as well. They issued their first report in June, and identified 4 challenges then related to the impact of the pandemic on some of the things like IT security and management, protecting the health and safety of the public, grants and guaranteed loan management, and financial management of relief funding. The new report that they issued just this month added 4 new challenges and those focus on the need to prevent and detect fraud against government programs, informing and protecting the public from about pandemic-related fraud, challenges related to data transparency and completeness, and the final challenge focused on federal workplace safety. Both of these reports are available, the SIGI one on the IGNet website and the PRAC report on the PRAC's website at pandemicoversight.gov. I would also note that if you're interested in recommendations to address these challenges, we have at oversight.gov all publicly available reports issued by inspectors general. You can search them, you can find recommendations that are made in those reports, and we are building a library of outstanding and unimplemented recommendations. We have 50 OIGs reporting those, so you can see where IGs have made recommendations in these areas that haven't yet been addressed. Finally, before I stop, I want to echo Christine's comment about diversity and inclusion. That's a challenge that our community is grappling with, both internally in terms of how we hire and how we manage our own staffs, but also in how we do our work and how we ensure that our audit plans are free from any sort of bias that could have an impact on our ultimate findings and recommendations. So we're grappling with that as well. And I'll turn the floor back over to you, Asif.
Great, thank you very much, Alison. We've got about just around 3 minutes left. Just maybe one conclusionary remark from any one of you, all of you, is a lot of these issues, I mean, you would imagine transition is a well-oiled machine. We have gone through it so many times since the founding of this nation, but how does one deal with issues that come up at the last minute that nobody have foreseen they'll be coming up? There are a couple of questions along that vein. I mean, how do those get handled? I mean, pandemic is one of them. The insurrection was another one. I mean, but there are other security issues that come up. Is there a danger that they could fall through the cracks, or there's a mechanism so they're caught in the net and they're handled the way they should be?
Well, I can start with that, but I'd love to hear from Alison and Kate on this. So the delay in ascertainment was just one of the issues that came up that was maybe not totally unexpected, but was certainly challenging in terms of this transition. But there are others, one of which is that the Transition Act and the recent amendments to the Act over the past few years require a tabletop exercise to address the possibility of some kind of a scenario that will require a whole of government response and some kind of a national or emergency declaration. The Trump administration did not hold that kind of exercise, even though they were supposed to under the law. But there are mechanisms in law that recognize on day one, administration needs to be ready for anything coming at them. The pandemic's something that we've seen coming and have been in the middle of for many months now, but there are other things that happen very unexpectedly. So that's one of the things that Congress is already doing, is looking at the current Transition Act to determine what needs to be amended, strengthened, what's not clear, how do we continue to make this process smoother and address the unexpected or places where the act hasn't worked as intended.
Great. So we have got just about 60 seconds left. I don't know if Kate or Alison, if you had anything to add.
Just quickly, Asif, I agree with what Christine said. After each presidential transition, there has been a reconsideration of the Presidential Transition Act based on what went well and what didn't. It's a well-known vulnerability in terms of our national security, that 2.5 months between the election day and the inauguration of the new president. And I'm sure that the Congress will be focused on what could be done to continue to improve the Presidential Transition Act and make resources available to respond to that concern.
Great. I'm glad to hear that, Kate. Thank you so much. Well, with this, we have really run the clock out. I really want to thank all of you, Christine, Allison, and Kate, for participating in this panel, and to you, the audience, for tuning in. Hopefully you got some useful information that would give you some more context to the transition and changes in administration and Congress. With that, I will close this session down, and I wish you all a very nice the rest of the day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Asif.
Thank you.
Thank you.